representative with the union. We've been doing a lot of analysis on the school district budget and their claim of a crisis. To sum up our analysis in short, I would say that the Oakland School District doesn't have a budget crisis. What they have done is produced a crisis budget. And what I mean by that is that the claims of a crisis are based on projected spending levels that are wildly inflated. As soon as you adjust those projections to more realistic fact-based levels, there will still be a deficit, but it's very easily manageable with the district's existing cash reserves. Before we begin, I want to note that all the data being presented here is not OEA's data. We did not make it up. It is all from the school district's own financial reports, the ones that they present to the school board and file with the state. These are their numbers. All OEA has done is compared the proposed future spending in the current budget to their actual past spending. All right, let's get into the data and see what we mean. The next slide. Why is their deficit projection so inflated? It's really just from two budget categories, what they call books and supplies, and the other is services and other operating expenses, which we call contracts and services or outside contracts because the huge proportion of spending in that category is on outside contracts. Next slide. So books and supplies. The district predicts that they will spend on average $92 million per year for each of the next 3 years. The red numbers are the district's projected budget. The blue numbers are what they actually spent in that same category for each of the past 5 years. Now, this district has never spent more than $40 million on books and supplies, and the average spending over the past 5 years is even lower than that. So it seems fairly ridiculous to propose that spending on this category would be so high. Next slide. The average, go back one, please. Here. In the red, you can see the district's projection. The green is the average of the past 5 years, and the blue is OEA's budget projection. Right, the average of the past 5 years spending on books and supplies was $32.5 million. To make our alternative budget projection, we actually chose the average of the past 4 years. That's a little higher just in order to provide some financial cushion. But the main point is that the OUSD's projected spending amount is very high. It's not based on their actual spending. We don't see any basis for predicting $90 million. If you reduce their inflated projection down to a realistic level, like we said, based on their actual spending, you can reduce the projected deficit by nearly $58 million. Next. Now let's look at the other area, outside contracts. Oakland predicts they will spend $182 million a year for each of the next 3 years. Again, that's in the red. Now, while this reflects last year's actual spending, it completely ignores the historical pattern. The pattern is that Oakland's spending on outside contracts has doubled in just 4 years. Even just 2 years ago, the district spent much less on contracts than it's proposing to spend this year and the next 2 years. Basically, there's been a huge spike in spending on contracts, which we think was driven by all the extra COVID relief money that the district got. Now, it's a terrible budget practice to base your future spending on a peak level. We think that they should plan to spend the average amount they've spent over the past 4 years rather than continue peak spending, especially when they're the ones saying they don't have the money to continue that kind of peak spending. If you bring their budget projection down to the average of the past 4 years, this would reduce the projected deficit by $48 million a year. Next slide. Now, is this, sorry, go back one. Thank you. Now, is this reasonable? This is very reasonable. In fact, what is unreasonable is Oakland's current spending pattern on outside contracts. Last year, Oakland spent 21% of its total budget on outside contracts. No other district spends nearly that much. These two charts here compare Oakland in the red to other large urban districts on the top and underneath other comparably sized districts from around the state. You can see that Oakland is a complete outlier in both cases. If they brought their spending down to 15 or 16% of total budget, this would put them in line with districts like San Francisco and San Jose. Next slide. We keep skipping forward too. I'll try and go back one. Thank you. So this table puts it all together and is a summary of OEA's alternative budget versus the OUSD's predicted budget, showing that with our realistic assumptions, you can bring the deficit under control. Now, our alternative budget has a bunch of other changes in it as well in terms of like, healthcare costs, employee spending, pension, et cetera. But those are in smaller scale. So in the interest of time, we're not going to go through all of that detail. But you'll see OEA's budget still runs a deficit, but it's much smaller, around $50 million instead of $150 million. Really, the last question we want to put an answer for you is that deficit, is that level of deficit sustainable? Let's go to the next slide. The answer is yes. Right? A small deficit like $50 million is modest. It is sustainable. Oakland currently has $300 million in cash reserves. That was the amount at the beginning of the school year in their financial report. The red bars here echo a graph which the district officials have been using all over the district and with the public to scare people. Right? They say they will run out of money in 2 years and be unable to make payroll in year 3. You can see OEA's projection in the blue. There's still a balance of around $150 million in the bank after 3 years. Now, districts of Oakland size are required to maintain a cash reserve of 3% of total budget. In OEA's scenario, the $150 million represents a reserve of around 15%. So that's still a very financially healthy school district. Next slide. This is my last one. Just to sum up, Oakland's crisis budget is based on wildly inflated, unrealistic spending assumptions for books and supplies and for outside contracts. If you adjust just those 2 budget areas to reasonable levels, which are based on the district's own spending patterns, this reduces the predicted deficit by over $100 million a year. Given the district's $300 million cash reserve, there's no problem with a few years of moderate deficit spending. OEA's alternative budget leaves the district in a financially healthy position at the end of 3 years. There is no budget crisis for the Oakland School District.